Caleb Whitmore stood frozen on a porch in Hollow Creek, Tennessee, holding a grocery bag that suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, staring into the face of the woman who had fired him from a job he'd given 11 years of his life to. She looked just as stunned as he did. Neither of them said a word for almost 10 full seconds. To understand how a laid-off warehouse manager ended up delivering groceries to his old boss's mother, we have to go back nearly a year, to the afternoon his career quietly ended inside a glass-walled conference room. If you believe people deserve a second chance, even the ones who once hurt you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Corner before we go back to the beginning. Every weekday, Caleb followed almost the same routine. He woke before sunrise in the cramped two-bedroom rental he shared with his son on the edge of Hollow Creek, a town tucked between low ridgelines an hour outside Knoxville. His 8-year-old son, Noah, usually slept with one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit, its left ear long gone, chewed off sometime during a move nobody liked to talk about. Caleb made oatmeal in the dark, packed Noah's lunch into the same dented lunchbox every morning, and left a note folded beside the cereal bowl whenever an early shift pulled him out before his son woke up. Life had become a careful, exhausting kind of math. Every gallon of gas mattered. Every grocery receipt got folded and tucked into his wallet, not thrown away, in case he needed to double-check where the money had gone. Any unexpected expense meant quietly moving money from somewhere else, usually somewhere that was already thin. 10 months earlier, none of that had felt necessary. Caleb had spent almost 11 years as an operations manager at Draymont Freight and Logistics, one of the fastest-growing shipping companies in East Tennessee. He wasn't the loudest voice in any meeting. He wasn't the kind of employee who chased attention. But he solved problems before they became disasters. He remembered which warehouse guys had new babies at home, and he stayed late without being asked whenever a shift was short-staffed. His closest friend at the company, a dock supervisor named Denny Okafor, used to joke that Caleb ran the place quietly from the second floor while the executives argued about branding upstairs. Then the board brought in a new chief executive. Her name was Renata Ashfield. She arrived with expensive consultants, polished slide decks, and a promise to modernize the entire operation. Within weeks, departments were reorganized, longtime supervisors were quietly replaced, and every decision, no matter how small, got measured against a spreadsheet. Caleb tried to adapt. He kept his head down. He sat through meetings where 20-year employees were reduced to efficiency percentages on a screen, but during one afternoon meeting, when leadership proposed cutting experienced night shift workers to save money before the holiday rush, he spoke up. He explained calmly and respectfully that trimming the most experienced hands right before peak season wouldn't save money. It would cost the company its most reliable customers. He'd seen it happen at a competitor 2 years earlier. Renata listened without interrupting. She didn't argue. She didn't even frown. She simply thanked him for his input and moved to the next slide. 2 days later, HR called him into a small, glass-walled conference room. His position, they said, had been eliminated. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, everyone in the building knew exactly why. Denny found him packing his desk into a cardboard box and didn't say anything at all. He just carried the box to Caleb's truck for him and shook his hand a little longer than usual at the door. Eventually, he took a job delivering groceries for a local courier service that partnered with the town's small grocery chain. The pay wasn't close to what he used to make, but it kept the lights on and food on the table, and some weeks barely it kept both. The work itself humbled him in ways he hadn't expected. He learned the weight of a case of canned soup against his shoulder, the particular ache of climbing 4 flights of apartment stairs twice in one afternoon, the sting of a customer who tipped nothing and complained anyway. One woman on his regular route called the courier company twice to complain that her eggs had arrived at the wrong angle in the bag, and Caleb apologized both times without letting his voice crack. One bitter afternoon in November, his van slid on a patch of black ice outside a strip mall, and he spent 40 minutes on the shoulder of the road with his hazards blinking, waiting for a tow while a full order of frozen groceries slowly began to thaw in the back seat. He lost that day's pay and still had to apologize to the customer over the phone. He didn't tell Noah about days like that. He just came home a little quieter, made dinner, and asked about school instead. One damp Thursday afternoon, His delivery route took him to a small yellow house at the end of Larkin Lane, its porch railing wrapped in climbing wisteria that hadn't been trimmed in years. Mrs. Adeline Foster answered the door almost 2 full minutes after he knocked. "Forgive me," she laughed softly, leaning on a cane she clearly resented using. "These knees negotiate every staircase like it's a hostage situation." She insisted on carrying one of the bags herself, and halfway across the porch she nearly dropped it. Caleb caught it gently. "I've got it, ma'am." She studied him for a moment, something soft crossing her face. "You remind me of my husband," she said. "He always thought he had to carry everything too." After that, Caleb saw her twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, sometimes more. Sometimes she'd forgotten batteries or tea. Sometimes she simply wanted to know how Noah was doing at school. Slowly, without either of them deciding it on purpose, the deliveries stopped feeling like work. Mrs. Foster had lived alone since losing her husband, Walter, nearly 16 years earlier. He'd been a shop teacher at the old high school before it closed, the kind of man who fixed neighbors' fences for the cost of the lumber and nothing more. And Mrs. Foster liked to say the whole town had come to his funeral because there wasn't a porch railing or a squeaky door within 5 miles he hadn't touched. Her only daughter traveled constantly for business and rarely visited. She never complained about that out loud. Instead, she filled the quiet by telling stories about dahlias that never quite survived a Tennessee summer, about an old beagle named Duke she'd loved decades ago, about a husband who used to whistle off-key while fixing things that weren't broken. Caleb usually stayed only a few minutes. He didn't want kindness to curdle into obligation, hers or his own. But he noticed things. The way her hands shook slightly when she poured tea, the way she checked the mailbox every day, even though her daughter rarely wrote back, the way she sometimes called him by her late husband's name for half a second before catching herself. Winter came early that year. One frost-heavy morning he noticed 3 days of newspapers piling up beside her front steps. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, called through the door, and felt his stomach twist tight. Just as he reached for his phone to call for help, the lock clicked. Mrs. Foster stood there wrapped in a quilt, pale and unsteady. "Just the flu," she admitted, waving him off. "You should have called someone," he said. "I didn't want to bother anybody." "You wouldn't have." That afternoon, after finishing his last delivery, Caleb came back with soup from a diner 2 blocks from his apartment, a place called the Copper Skillet, where the owner, a heavy-set woman named Fran, had started slipping an extra roll into his bag for free once she learned he had a kid at home. He left the soup by Mrs. Foster's door with a handwritten note, no signature. She knew exactly who it was from. 2 days later, when her fever hadn't broken, he drove her to the urgent care clinic himself, sitting in the waiting room with Noah's homework spread across his knees so his son wouldn't fall behind, and didn't leave until the doctor confirmed it was nothing worse than a stubborn flu. After that, helping simply became part of the rhythm. He fixed a flickering porch light. He raked leaves before an ice storm. He carried the heavy bags in without being asked twice. Some Saturdays he brought Noah along, and the boy would fix her lopsided bird feeder, while Mrs. Foster baked cinnamon muffins that always tasted warmer than muffins had any right to. Watching them together, Caleb realized his son smiled more in that cramped little kitchen than he had anywhere else in months. One afternoon, staring out at her overgrown backyard, Mrs. Foster said quietly, "People think loneliness is loud." She paused. "It isn't. Mostly it just sounds like an empty kitchen at 6 in the evening." Caleb never forgot that sentence. By December, money had gotten painfully tight. Noah needed new winter boots, the car needed brake work it couldn't wait on, and Caleb's landlord announced a rent increase starting in February. One night after Noah had gone to bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring at a stack of bills, doing math that refused to add up no matter how many times he ran it. For the first time since losing his job at Draymont, he wondered if he'd failed his son. Not because he wasn't working. He was working harder than he ever had, but because no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't seem to get ahead. He thought about calling Danielle, about asking if she could send anything, and then he thought better of it. He'd learned not to expect what she couldn't give. 2 weeks before Christmas, the landlord left a formal notice taped to the door, a warning about the rent increase, and a reminder that late payments would no longer be tolerated the way they had been the year before. Caleb read it standing in the hallway, then folded it and put it in the same drawer where he kept the receipts, as if hiding it might make it smaller. He picked up 2 extra delivery shifts that week, working past dark both nights, and still came up almost $60 short of what the new rent would require. The next morning, Noah caught him rubbing his temples over coffee. "We're okay, right, Dad?" Caleb forced a smile. "We're okay, buddy." He wasn't entirely sure he believed it. That Christmas was smaller than the ones before it. Caleb found a second-hand bike for Noah at a church rummage sale and spent 2 nights after his son was asleep sanding the rust off the frame and repainting it a deep forest green in the kitchen, newspaper spread across the floor to catch the drips. Noah never asked why the bike smelled faintly of paint on Christmas morning. He just rode it up and down the icy driveway until his cheeks went red, grinning the whole time, and Caleb decided that was worth more than anything wrapped in store-bought paper could have been. In January, during a stretch of freezing rain, Mrs. Foster's daughter called Caleb directly. She'd found his number through the delivery service's records. "This is a little embarrassing," she admitted, her voice careful and clipped, the voice of someone used to giving instructions rather than asking favors. "My mother won't tell me when she needs help. Would you mind checking on her this week? I'm stuck out of state." "Of course," he told her, keeping his own voice neutral, professional, the voice he used to use in meetings at Draymont. He didn't recognize the name Ashfield as anything more than a common last name. Not yet. That week became 2 weeks, then 3. Somewhere along the way, without ever being formally asked, Caleb had become the person everyone trusted to look after Adeline Foster, not because anyone hired him for it, because he simply kept showing up. Then one Tuesday afternoon in early spring, everything changed. Mrs. Foster had mentioned almost offhand that her daughter was finally coming home for a visit after months away, some big trip back from a work conference in Chicago. Caleb picked up her usual groceries, added a small bouquet of pink tulips he paid for out of his own thin pocket because she loved spring flowers even when the ground outside was still half frozen, and drove to the familiar yellow house. He climbed the porch steps, knocked twice and heard footsteps approaching. The door opened. Standing there in a tailored charcoal suit, looking completely frozen in place, was Renata Ashfield, and this is the exact moment we started with. For several long seconds, neither of them said a word. Recognition crossed her face almost instantly. "Caleb." He nodded once, keeping his voice even, dropping off groceries. Her eyes moved from him to the bags, then back to his face. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Behind her, Mrs. Foster's voice rang out cheerfully from the living room. "Is that Caleb? Tell him I found the recipe for those muffins he likes." Renata stepped aside without another word, and Caleb walked past her into the kitchen he now knew better than his own. Mrs. Foster's whole face lit up when she saw him. "There you are. I've told my daughter about you every single week." Caleb set the groceries down exactly where they went, milk in the door of the fridge, bread beside the fruit bowl, tea in the cabinet above the stove, trying to ignore the heavy silence pressing in behind him. Renata watched him move through her mother's kitchen like he'd done it 100 times, because he had. It was obvious this wasn't his first visit, not even close. Mrs. Foster laughed. "He spoiled me rotten." Caleb shrugged. "You do the same for me." Quietly, almost cautiously, Renata asked, "You've been helping my mother this whole time?" "She's helped me too." "How?" "She reminded me that not everybody measures a person's worth by their job title." The kitchen went quiet again. For the first time since Caleb had known her, Renata Ashfield looked uncertain instead of composed. Her eyes drifted around the house, the newly repaired lamp in the corner, the freshly shoveled walkway visible through the window, the fixed gate latch, small things she hadn't noticed because she hadn't been there often enough to notice them. She looked down at her hands. "I thought Mom had hired someone," Mrs. Foster answered before Caleb could. "Couldn't afford someone like him." She smiled gently. "Lucky for me, kindness doesn't send invoices." Renata didn't respond right away. Instead, she crossed to the dining room window and stood there a long moment, watching Noah outside filling the crooked bird feeder he and Caleb had patched together weeks earlier instead of replacing. Renata stayed at that window longer than anyone expected. She watched the boy sprinkle seed into the feeder while humming something off-key to himself, the wooden box leaning slightly because he and his father had chosen to fix it rather than throw it out. Mrs. Foster had insisted it looked more charming, crooked. Finally, Renata turned back to Caleb. "I owe you an apology." He looked at her for a moment before answering. "You don't owe me anything today. Today's about your mother." "Mrs." Foster smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has lived long enough to recognize when two people are carrying a much heavier conversation than the words coming out of their mouths. "I'd still like to say it," Renata said. Caleb didn't answer right away. Months earlier, he would have imagined this exact moment differently, sharp words, maybe some satisfaction in watching her squirm. But standing in Adeline Foster's warm kitchen, surrounded by grocery bags and the smell of fresh coffee, none of that anger felt worth holding on to anymore. "People make decisions," he said finally. "Sometimes they turn out to be the wrong ones." Mrs. Foster excused herself to check on the kettle, giving them privacy without making it obvious. Renata folded her hands together. "When I took over as CEO, I convinced myself that every decision had to come down to efficiency. I spent weeks buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I knew everyone's employee number before I knew half their names." She gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "I actually thought I was making the company stronger." Caleb remembered that conference room, the polished table, the folder already waiting for him before he'd even sat down. "You didn't just cut a position," he said quietly. "You cut 11 years of somebody's life." "I know." The admission surprised him more than he expected. "Nobody on that floor was willing to tell me I'd made a mistake," she continued. "Everyone was too busy trying to impress the new CEO. My board praised the cost savings. Meanwhile," she glanced toward the kitchen doorway, "I barely noticed the one person who actually mattered was getting older without me. My father used to say the same thing about my mother when he was still alive. I didn't listen to him either. I told myself I'd visit more once things settled down at work. Things never settle down. There's always another quarter, another crisis, another reason it can wait." Mrs. Foster returned carrying 3 mugs of tea. "Enough serious faces," she said briskly. "Tea tastes better with lighter conversation." They all laughed, quietly, and for almost an hour they talked about ordinary things, the unusually cold winter, Noah's science fair project about magnets, Mrs. Foster's 4th doomed attempt at growing dahlias, and a long, meandering story about Walter once trying to build a treehouse without measuring anything first. It was strangely comfortable. When Caleb finally stood to leave, Renata walked him out to the porch. The late afternoon sun slipped behind the maples lining the street, stretching long shadows across the quiet lane. "I'd like to ask you something," she said. "If it's about coming back to Draymont," Caleb said gently before she could finish, "I'm not interested." She accepted that without arguing. "I understand." He adjusted the empty grocery bags Mrs. Foster wanted recycled. "I don't hate the company," he added. "I know. I just don't think I belong there anymore." Renata nodded again, then hesitated. "Would you at least let me explain something?" He waited. The board reviewed everything that happened after the restructuring. Turnover spiked. Customer complaints doubled in 2 quarters. Every experienced supervisor who could leave left because they stopped feeling respected. She sighed. "I've spent months trying to fix problems I helped create." Caleb appreciated the honesty. It didn't erase what had happened, but it wasn't nothing either. "I hope you fix it," he said. "The people still there deserve better than what I got." That was the whole conversation. No dramatic confrontation, no triumphant speech. Just 2 adults standing on an aging porch, talking honestly for maybe the first time in their lives. Driving home that evening, Caleb passed the old Draymont warehouse off Route 9. Its loading dock lit up under sodium lights, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the familiar twist of resentment in his chest. He felt something closer to relief. He texted Denny that night just to check in, and Denny wrote back almost immediately. "Heard the new CEO's been different lately. Actually listens now. Wonder what changed." Caleb smiled at his phone and didn't answer. Over the following weeks, Life mostly continued the way it had before. Caleb delivered groceries. Noah finished his magnet project and got a B+ he was oddly proud of. Mrs. Foster proudly announced she'd kept exactly one dahlia alive indoors through the tail end of winter. But one thing had noticeably changed. Renata started visiting every weekend. At first, the visits felt stiff and awkward. She couldn't remember which cabinet held the mugs anymore. She overwatered the houseplants. She forgot her own mother liked her tea with honey, not sugar. Mrs. Foster teased her without mercy. "You run a whole logistics company," she laughed one Saturday, "and you can't find where I keep the sugar." Slowly, the visits stretched longer. Sometimes Renata stayed overnight. Sometimes she cooked dinner, though her mother gently suggested fewer expensive experiments and more simple recipes that actually turned out edible. One Sunday, Renata asked her mother to teach her Walter's old cornbread recipe, the one written on an index card so faded the measurements were barely legible, and the two of them spent an entire afternoon in the kitchen arguing gently about whether it called for buttermilk or plain milk, until Mrs. Foster finally admitted she honestly couldn't remember, and they'd just have to guess. One afternoon, Caleb arrived with groceries to find Renata out on the porch, repainting the old railing herself, a streak of white paint across one sleeve of an obviously expensive sweater. He couldn't help smiling. "Didn't think CEOs did their own painting." She laughed, real and unguarded. "My mother fired the last contractor." From inside, Mrs. Foster called out, "Charge too much and talk too little." The three of them shared an easy laugh that would have seemed impossible 7 months earlier. Another Saturday, Renata showed up with a folder under her arm, awkward and a little nervous, and asked Caleb if he'd be willing to look over some proposed changes to the warehouse scheduling software, purely as a favor, purely because he understood the floor in a way none of her consultants ever had. He almost said no out of habit. Then he thought of Denny, still working nights on that same floor, and spent 20 minutes marking up her printout with a pencil borrowed from Mrs. Foster's kitchen drawer. Small things, nothing that undid the past, but they added up. Not everything moved smoothly. In late March, Denny called Caleb late one night, his voice tight in a way Caleb hadn't heard before. A regional competitor was undercutting Draymont's rates, and rumors were spreading through the warehouse about a second round of layoffs, this time targeting the very night crew Caleb had once tried to protect. Caleb felt his stomach drop, an old, familiar dread. He almost called Renata that night to say something sharp, to remind her how easily promises could evaporate under board pressure. Instead, he waited 2 days, and when he finally saw her at Mrs. Foster's house that weekend, he simply told her what Denny had told him, plainly, without accusation. Renata listened, her jaw tight, and admitted the board had floated the idea, but she hadn't approved it, and didn't intend to. "I said I'd fix things," she told him, "not perform fixing them for a quarterly report." 2 weeks later, the rumored layoffs quietly disappeared from the agenda. Denny never learned exactly why, and Caleb never told him. In April, Mrs. Foster had a small scare that shook everyone. She fainted briefly in the garden while planting the same dahlias that never quite made it through summer, and it was Noah, out filling the bird feeder, who found her and ran inside, screaming for help. Caleb had been 2 streets away finishing a delivery when he got the call, and he broke every speed limit getting back. By the time he arrived, Mrs. Foster was sitting up on the porch steps insisting she was fine, embarrassed more than anything, but Caleb drove her to the clinic anyway, Noah silent and pale in the back seat the whole way. The doctors called it mild dehydration and a stumble, nothing more, but it rattled something loose in all of them. Renata arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, having driven straight from a board meeting, still in her suit, and when she saw her mother sitting up in the exam room, safe and irritated at the fuss, she didn't say anything at all. She just sat down on the edge of the bed and held her mother's hand until the discharge papers were signed. Afterward, in the parking lot, she quietly asked Caleb if he thought her mother needed more help than any of them had been giving her. He told her the truth, that Mrs. Foster would fight tooth and nail against feeling like a burden, and that the answer probably wasn't hiring someone new, it was simply more people showing up more often. Renata took that seriously. Within a month, she'd rearranged her work travel schedule to keep Thursdays clear every single week, no exceptions, and told her assistant to reschedule anything that conflicted. Spring pushed winter out for good. The trees along Larkin Lane filled in green, and birds came back to the feeder Noah faithfully refilled every Saturday morning. One afternoon, Caleb got a call from a regional produce distributor headquartered outside Knoxville, Southland Provisions. Weeks earlier, he'd interviewed for an operations role and assumed after hearing nothing that they'd gone with someone else. The hiring manager apologized for the delay. "We filled that position internally," she explained, "but another opening just came up, and honestly, your references were some of the strongest we've seen all year." Caleb went in for the interview, wore the one good shirt he still owned, and answered every question with the steady confidence of a man who had spent 11 years solving other people's problems. A week later, he had the job. The salary wasn't extravagant. There was no corner office waiting for him, but it offered stability, reasonable hours, and a company that seemed to actually value experienced people instead of running them off a spreadsheet. When he told Mrs. Foster, she clapped her hands together like he'd announced a wedding. "Knew somebody would finally recognize what I've known all along." And what's that? Reliable people always find their way eventually. On Caleb's first morning at Southland Provisions, Noah insisted on ironing his father's shirt himself, and the collar came out slightly crooked. Neither of them minded. As Caleb headed for the door, Noah looked up at him. "You seem happier." "I think I am. New job helps?" He thought about it a second longer. "What else?" Noah asked. Caleb glanced across the neighborhood, toward the small yellow house where Mrs. Foster was almost certainly out watering flowers far too early in the season. "I remembered something important," he said. "What's that?" "A person's worth doesn't get decided the day they lose a job." At Southland, Caleb quickly earned a reputation for the same quiet reliability that had defined him at Draymont, and within 4 months his supervisor mentioned almost casually that a senior operations position might open up by summer. Caleb didn't chase it. He just kept doing the work the way he always had, and let the rest sort itself out. He also found himself training a 19-year-old warehouse hand named Tyler, a kid who reminded him a little of himself at that age, eager but unsure where to put his energy, and Caleb made a point of teaching him the same things Denny had once taught him: how to read a shipping manifest at a glance, how to spot a scheduling problem 3 days before it became a crisis. Meanwhile, back at Draymont, Denny called one evening to say morale on the floor had noticeably shifted. Renata had reversed 2 of the harshest scheduling cuts, personally walked the warehouse floor twice a month, and had started something she called listening sessions, unglamorous meetings where frontline workers could raise concerns without a consultant in the room translating them into corporate language first. Denny laughed when he said it. "Never thought I'd hear myself say a nice thing about that woman." Caleb laughed too and meant it. Months later, Mrs. Adeline Foster celebrated her 83rd birthday. It was a small gathering, neighbors bringing homemade desserts, kids chasing each other around the yard, somebody stringing simple lights along the fence that stayed up long after the party ended. Renata arrived carrying a homemade apple pie, slightly lopsided, but unmistakably made from scratch. Mrs. Foster inspected it with theatrical seriousness. "You made this yourself?" "I did." "We'll see." Everyone laughed. Fran from the copper skillet showed up too, uninvited but welcomed, carrying a tray of biscuits she refused to let anyone pay for. Even Denny drove out from town with his wife and their new baby and spent 20 minutes on the porch trading warehouse stories with Renata, like old co-workers instead of a laid-off friend's old boss. Tyler came too, awkward in a borrowed tie, and spent most of the party trailing Caleb around like a kid brother, which Caleb found he didn't mind at all. At one point, Danielle called Noah's phone to wish him well on an unrelated Tuesday, the kind of call that used to sting Caleb with old resentment. This time he just handed Noah the phone, stepped back, and let his son have the conversation on his own terms. Some wounds, he was learning, didn't need to be healed all at once. They just needed room to breathe. After dinner, Mrs. Foster tapped her glass gently for quiet. "I've lived long enough to know people spend way too much energy chasing impressive moments," she said, looking around the backyard at the string lights and the paper plates and the kids still running in circles. "But most of a life gets built out of ordinary Tuesdays." Her eyes landed on Caleb, on a bag of groceries left on a porch step a year earlier. Then On Noah, on a bird feeder 2 people had chosen to fix instead of replace. Then on Renata, on a daughter who finally decided to come home. "Those things matter more than people ever seem to realize," she said softly. Nobody rushed to fill the silence that followed. The quiet itself felt like enough. A year after that, on a warm afternoon in early June, Renata stood in front of a room full of Draymont employees, the same conference room where Caleb had once been let go, and announced a new mentorship program pairing veteran staff with new hires, funded in part by cuts to executive travel budgets rather than the workforce. She didn't mention Caleb by name. She didn't need to. Denny texted him a photo of the announcement flyer with a single line underneath. "This one's got your fingerprints all over it, even if she doesn't say so." Caleb read it standing in his own kitchen, Noah doing homework at the table behind him, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. That same summer, Mrs. Foster's dahlias, against every expectation and years of failure, finally bloomed, a stubborn row of deep red blossoms along the back fence that she insisted on showing to absolutely everyone who came by, including the mail carrier, who had learned to simply admire them without breaking stride. As another evening faded into soft gold light over Larkin Lane, Caleb thought back to those brutal months after Draymont let him go, the folded receipts, the note beside the cereal bowl, the nights doing math that never quite worked out. Kindness hadn't solved every problem back then. It hadn't erased the financial stress overnight, and it hadn't rewritten the past. But it had quietly connected people who might otherwise have stayed strangers, each of them carrying their own weight alone. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was more than enough. In the end, Caleb never got his old job back. He didn't need to. He built something worth far more, a life defined not by what had been taken from him, but by the kindness he chose to give when he had every reason in the world to stop. If this story moved you even a little, don't scroll past without hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need a reminder that kindness still counts. Subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss the next story like this one, and turn on notifications so you catch new videos the moment they go up. Drop a comment below and tell us, has a small act of kindness ever changed the course of your life or someone else's? We read every single comment, and your story might inspire the next video on this channel. Share this with someone who's had a hard year and needs to be reminded that showing up for people quietly, without expecting anything back, still matters more than almost anything else. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next story.